Welcome. My name is Robert Boynton. I'm a professor at the Journalism Institute here at NYU. I want to thank you for coming to this event, which is co-sponsored by the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute and the NYU Law School. I first learned about these issues after the revelation that Horace Mann School had ignored dozens of reports of sexual abuse over several decades, and some of it committed by teachers I had studied with. Unfortunately, this is a very current topic. As we've learned over the years, this is not just about Catholic churches or schools. It's not about Orthodox churches or temples or schools. It's not about private schools. It's not about inner city schools. This is about everybody. It's an enormous topic that we have chosen to talk about, and we realize that there's a certain folly in trying to pack so much into one panel. But we merely hope to encourage and continue the conversation. There's never going to be a foolproof way of preventing sexual abuse, because we're all fallen, we're all flawed people, and that won't change. The only remedy is to make it as easy as possible for those who have not been abused to talk about the subject, and those who have been abused to come forward to get help. During the last 60 years, American society has rethought the legal status of African Americans, of women, of gay people, and I believe that recognizing the legal rights of sexually abused children is part of this unfolding American tradition and very important. We have an amazing panel tonight. I'm just going to give some very brief introductions. We have Richard Condon, who's the Special Commissioner of Investigation for New York City Public Schools. Commissioner Condon served as the Police Commissioner and First Deputy Commissioner with the New York City Police Department and as Deputy Coordinator of Criminal Justice for New York City. We have Martin Guggenheim, who's the Fiorello LaGuardia Professor of Clinical Law at NYU Law School. He's a nationally recognized expert in the field of children and the law, and among his many publications is What's Wrong with Children's Rights, Harvard University Press, 2007. Marcy Hamilton is the Paul R. Vercool Chair in Public Law at Benjamin Cardozo Law School. Professor Hamilton is the author of God versus the Gavel, The Perils of Extreme Religious Liberty, Justice Denied, What America Must Do to Protect Its Children, which is literally the book on this subject. She also hosts www.rfraperils.com, which tracks free exercise statutes in all 50 states, and an amazing site if you're interested in statute of limitations, sol/reform.com, which tracks movements for legislative reform of statutes of limitation for child sex abuse survivors. We have Stephanie Nilva, the Executive Director of Day One, which is an organization that partners with New York City youth to end dating abuse and domestic violence through community education. And John Seiger, a Horace Mann alum. John is a graduate of the New England Conservatory of Music and one of the few deaf musicians. He studied with Jimmy Gouffre, John McNeil, Roy Eldridge, and he's played with the Drifters, the Shirelles, Ella Fitzgerald, Doc Cheatham, Maynard Ferguson, Billy Eckstein, and many others. We have Cheryl Shakeshaft, Professor Cheryl Shakeshaft of the Department of Education Leadership at Virginia Commonwealth University. In 2004, Professor Shakeshaft published Educator, Sexual Misconduct, a synthesis of existing literature for the United States Department of Education, which is an incredibly comprehensive document. Her book, Educator, Sexual Misconduct, will be published in 2015. And we have Judge Leslie Crocker Snyder. Judge Snyder founded and led the first sex crimes prosecution unit in the nation and reformed many of New York's rape laws, including co-authoring New York's Rape Shield Law. She served as a judge in the New York State Supreme Court for over 20 years, and she is leading the investigation into the decades of sexual abuse at Horace Mann, which is how I've had the pleasure and honor of working with her.
We've been fighting for equal rights for the victims of rape and sexual abuse for over 40 years. And it's been a tough fight. First, we had to totally remedy the evidentiary requirements in rape cases, Back in the 1960s and 70s, it was almost impossible to get an indictment for rape. If you were robbed, if you were assaulted, you could go into the courtroom, raise your right hand, and a jury or a judge would decide on your veracity. But if you were raped, you never got into that courtroom, or if you were sexually abused, because there were so many more requirements. We fought that battle, we won it, it took us a long time. Then we had to fight the battle of fairness in the courtroom for the victims of rape and sexual abuse, because they were forced into hours of tortured testimony about their prior sexual history, which was totally irrelevant, had nothing to do with the case. They were put on trial. So we wrote rape shield laws, which have made a big difference. Then we worked to make certain that everyone out there, including judges and juries, would understand the nature of rape. And we're still working on that. Rape is a crime of violence. Rape is a crime of power, control, degradation, humiliation, sexual abuse, of course. When I talk about rape, I mean that too. And we're still fighting that battle. We still have trouble in the courtroom convincing juries that someone didn't ask for it, or someone was wearing too short a skirt, even though that's not allowed in New York. So this battle has gone on for years, and it's going on today. And right now, you've seen all the media attention on sexual abuse in universities and colleges, and sexual abuse, well, not as much attention on sexual abuse in the schools. Together with Rob Boynton, who is a professor of journalism here at the Arthur L. Carter School of Journalism, I refer to it as the J School, who is a graduate of Horace Mann, Haverford, and Yale. We've been working hard on this symposium, which is, I understand, being watched by a lot of people online. We hope so, Rob, because we spent a lot of time trying to get you a small view of a huge problem. This problem exists, as you know, in the church, in the military, it exists in sports. We can't touch upon all that tonight in the short time we have. So we're focusing upon two things, as you know from the title of the symposium. Sexual abuse epidemic in colleges and universities, which has gotten, as I said, tremendous press. And what hasn't gotten enough press is the sexual abuse of younger children, the sexual abuse of elementary, middle, and high school students, because that's an epidemic. And this tonight is not about Horace Mann, but I do want to use it as an example a few times during the course of the evening. Here are some statistics that should shock anyone who doesn't know them already. At the Horace Mann elite private school, over decades of abuse, there were, that we know of to date, 63 victims of this sexual abuse, mostly, almost all boys, young boys, 22 abusers, starting with one of the headmasters, who was himself a major pedophile, who seemed to encourage and attract people to teach there, outstanding teachers who were well respected, which Dr. Shakeshaft will address as a kind of hallmark of the child predator. We'll hear more about that later. But suffice it to say that it is extremely important to focus on both these areas. And we're privileged to have with us tonight a wonderful panel, you heard about them, but her time is limited, but having agreed to give the keynote remarks is our wonderful Congresswoman, Carolyn Maloney. Don't get up yet, because I still have to say a few things about you, Carolyn. I have limited this resume because it's so long, but anyone who knows Carolyn Maloney knows that she has been at the forefront of a fight for women's rights, equal rights, and that fight is still going on. She's done many wonderful things. I'll read a little bit from the canned remarks, but they don't really begin to tell the battle that she is engaged in every day. She was first elected to Congress in 1992. She's recognized as a national leader in many areas, not just women's rights, but that's the one I want to focus on. Her career has been a series of firsts. Carolyn is the first woman to represent New York's 12th Congressional District, the first woman to represent New York City's 6th Council. She was the first woman to give birth in office, which is something, you know, she'd be very proud of. She was the first woman to chair the Joint Economic Committee, a House and Senate panel that examines and addresses some of the nation's most pressing economic issues. And I should add that only 18 women in history have chaired congressional committees, which is kind of sad, isn't it? Well, I've got to get to the many pages here. Hold on. skipping over many details. Her landmark legislation, and this is such an important area, it includes the Debbie Smith Act that provides federal funds to help clear up the backlog of rape test kits. And this is essential to both the accuser and the accused. And until we do this, there's going to be injustice out there. Her Campus Sexual Violence Elimination Act, or Campus SAVE Act as it's known, became a part of the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. The Sexual Assault Forensic Reporting Act, which she co-sponsored, provides grants for state and local governments to conduct audits of unprocessed kits in their backlog. She sponsored the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. She's leading the fight for a National Women's History Museum on National Mall. And most recently, she is the lead in the House on what I call CASA. I think it's known as CASA. That is the Campus Accountability and Safety Act. This is a critical bill which I hope has a chance of getting passed. It has bipartisan support in the Senate, led by our Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, and Brooke from her office is here tonight. I don't know where you are, Brooke, but Brooke has done a lot of good work on this, as has Senator Gillibrand, and as I said, a whole bipartisan group. So I'm very hopeful that this will get passed. And as Carolyn is going to tell you, it involves finally forcing under Title IX and the Clery Act, campuses, college and universities to have accountability, transparency, training, help for people who have been victimized, and we'll hear more about this in detail. So it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney.
Thank you, Leslie, and for all of you for being here and focusing on this important topic. In fact, I have two New York University interns here that are working with me in my office that are going to stay and report back to me on the wonderful panel, since I have another speech to give later on. And I want to give a special thank you to Judge Leslie Snyder for the introduction and for her groundbreaking work with the Manhattan DA's office in creating the nation's first sex crimes prosecution unit. And the DA's office has really led the country in reforms, not only in her area, having authored the Rape Shield Law, which was incredibly important, but her unit also came up with the very creative, important idea of convicting DNA, which is really critical in getting convictions in rape, so that the DNA was convicted, and if the statute of limitations ran, you could still convict the rapist, which the FBI tells us that they will rape 7 other people. They're sick people, so everyone you convict and get off the street, so you could save the lives of 7 other people. This groundbreaking work was copied by the federal government, and we passed the Rape Shield law on the federal level, and also the so-called John Doe conviction, the conviction of DNA. And all of this was part of Leslie Snyder's work. I also want to thank her for standing for office. She ran for DA, and I think every time a woman takes a groundbreaking step forward, trailblazer as you are, it helps move all of us forward. So I thank her for her remarkable work and what she continues to do. The terrible examples of sexual assault on colleges and university campuses has been in the news lately. I thank the media for covering it and giving it important coverage. And it rightly so should be in the media. The FBI ranks rape as the second worst crime, preceded only by murder in terms of the devastating effect that it has on its victim. With 1 in 5 women are sexually assaulted, this is a national problem. I would call it a national scandal. And that's why I'm so pleased that President Obama earlier this year created the White House Task Force to protect students from sexual assault in order to elevate this issue onto a national platform and start a badly needed dialogue, which he has accomplished. And I am honored to be here today to continue that dialogue with this incredibly important institution. It seems that a week does not go by without a new report of a case of sexual assault that has been mismanaged. Whether it's a case that revolves around an NFL star or a young person just trying to get a good education, a mismanaged case is a stain on our justice system, and causes needless harm to a life already in turmoil. That's why protecting students from sexual assault is so important to me, and why I joined with Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania to author the Campus Sexual Violence Elimination Act, or the Campus Save Act, as we called it. This bill is now the law of our land. Congress approved it last year as part of the Violence Against Women Act that President Obama signed into law. This important law was one of the first that I ever worked on when I went to Congress. It passed in 1994, and we have strengthened it and extended it many, many times, as we did last year. The Campus Save Act now requires universities to include data on sexual assault in their annual public security reports that will help to ensure that all students know their rights and the campus's policies relating to sexual assault. And I will say that it'll be an important tool to government, but also to parents and to students, to study how universities treat their rights, whether or not they prosecute crimes, or whether they sweep them under the table and expel the woman who's been raped, which is what happens too often. Last week, the Department of Education issued final regulations to fully implement the Campus Save, and these improvements will soon take effect. The law also requires annual reports on the prevalence of sexual campus assaults. This can help to shed light on what works and what doesn't work. It's this kind of data that campuses and community leaders, as well as policymakers, need to study to be informed about effective choices and effective policies. Unfortunately, we know that there's a lot we don't know, because far too many instances of sexual assault go unreported for many of the reasons that Leslie said. And every time that happens, it means young victims don't get the support that they need, and that a perpetrator walks again free to offend and hurt and victimize someone else. We know that most sexual assaults are committed by someone the victim knows, and that 40% of the survivors of campus sexual assaults said they feared reprisal from their perpetrators. Many women have said that they were discouraged by the universities, or wherever it happened, from coming forward to file a report. And they fear that the report will become public, but often the schools do not want the report that a rape happened on their campus. We need to make it less intimidating to come forward and tell the truth, to take the next step after Campus Save. This year I worked with Senators McCaskill and Gillibrand and introduced the House version of the Bipartisan Campus Accountability and Safety Act in July, the so-called CASA Act. The bill was introduced with equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans. We wanted to keep it balanced. The best legislation I've always felt is bipartisan, and we needed to move forward in a bipartisan way. It requires universities to designate someone as the confidential advisor to act as a trusted resource for victims. It also requires climate surveys using aggregate data that can shed some light on the unreported incidents, data that will be available to the public but still protects the identity of victims. The bill also requires better coordination between campus and local community and law enforcement, and sets minimum training standards for campus personnel. If institutions fail to comply or have negligent violations, the bill allows the Department of Education to levy stiffer penalties than are currently permitted. These are real reforms. They're tough, but they're needed, and we're continuing to gain support. The New York City Council has introduced a resolution supporting the federal legislation, and next week they will be holding hearings on it. I think it would be totally appropriate if some of your students or this panel would submit your findings into the official record of the City Council, which I could then put into the findings in Congress, because I feel that what you're doing tonight is very important and will help us pass this bill. But even when there is widespread agreement on what the problems are, it is a hard, slow process to change culture. And it's made all the more difficult by the fact that each year a quarter of all students are new to campuses. So we could make our work on college campuses easier and more successful if we started earlier. We need prevention and education campaigns that start in high school. In 2011, in a 2011 survey, nearly 12% of girls and 5% of boys in grades 9 through 12 reported that they were forced to have sexual intercourse at some time in their young lives. We could also encourage more schools to institute bystander training, which is so important, programs to begin to change campus culture. Bystanding programs empower people to just speak up when they see a situation that looks aggressive or inappropriate. And sometimes that can make all the difference and stop an activity. If we can elevate the conversation to the national level and get programs going on a local level in each and every school, we could teach all our students some invaluable lessons and allow them to focus on classwork, studying, writing, and getting a great education. There is no silver bullet to this problem, but with forums like this and with your efforts, we can and will make progress. And I want to thank you for inviting me today, and thank you for the work that you're doing to help prevent sexual assaults and help the victims of sexual violence. So let's keep talking and working together to keep our campuses safe. I just want to conclude to say that I feel that all of the women's movement and challenges are very much intertwined, and that sexual safety on campuses is very much intertwined with the whole fight for respect and equality for women. As Leslie mentioned, I'm trying to pass a bill that would create a commission to study the idea of creating a women's museum on or near the Capitol. And I came to this idea after walking around the mall and seeing museums for stamps, for law and order, for every ethnic group that ever existed, for every cause that ever existed, but half the population was not represented. And there are many sliver museums for women, like women in the gowns that they wore for the inaugural, museums for women artists, for the women out west, but not a comprehensive look at the substantial contributions of women. We did a study, and of all the statues in the Capitol, there are 214, only 9 are of women. In textbooks, the women are spoken about usually 10% of the time, and in the national museums or monuments or historical sites, out of 2,500, only 5% are women. Yet, as they say, we hold up half the sky and are certainly half of the progress of this great nation and all the great men that accomplished many things. There were many women helping them. So I thought this will be easy. So I put in a bill. It's 15 years later. And I'm trying to understand, what is the opposition to this? It costs no money. It creates a commission to study the idea of a women's museum. And I would say that there is no idea in this country that is so controversial that it can't be debated. Yet the opposition will prevent this from even being debated. And I find it astonishing. I passed it in the House overwhelmingly with Marsha Blackburn, with over 383 members voting for it, 30 against. And it went to the Senate. Both the Republican and Democratic leaders support it. All the women, both parties, everybody supports it. But 2 men say that they don't like it because it costs money. Now, Marsha Blackburn is very conservative. She wrote into the bill in 3 separate areas, no money. But they say that in the future, at some time, someplace, it may cost money. And I'm sitting there, what is going on? This is crazy. Now, we're going to have some events around this that we're going to try to get it through the lame duck. But I feel that it's, I find it really associated with the lack of respect for women on campuses. And the Equal Rights Amendment, I came to Congress, I had 3 goals. I was going to build a 2nd Avenue subway. It's going to be completed in 2016, the first leg. They had cut aid to the city of New York by 75%. I was going to try to reverse that. We have reversed that in spades. But in terms of women's rights, if anything, I've seen erosion, a loss of ground. We just had a meeting with Sarah Waddington that carried the Supreme Court case in 1973, Roe v. Wade, and there are constant attempts to chip and roll that back and abolish that in the United States Congress that have passed the House of Representatives. So the effort for women has, if anything, met a tidal wave going against it. And just thought about it riding in the cab down tonight, and I want to share this with you. I see the Equal Rights Amendment very much tied to campus safety. A landmark decision was a Christie Brancala decision in 1994. We passed the Violence Against Women Act, and in it, it had a provision that allowed women to sue for their civil rights. Christie Brancala is very similar to the reports we read in the paper every day. In her first week at school at VPI, she was raped by 3 football stars, 2 of whom confessed that they did in fact rape her. So she goes to the college for some justice, and of course they don't want to harm their football stars, so they basically tell her to be quiet and leave. So then she appeals to the city government. They do nothing. She appeals to the state of Virginia. They do nothing. She appeals to the Supreme Court, and they strike her case down, saying women are not in the Constitution. She has no standing to sue. So I'm saying if we could get this simple right in the Constitution, then women that are raped on campus would have a recourse. Too often, when they take their case to the schools, and oftentimes it is football players, stars, that confess, and they get a promotion, and the woman is shamed out of school. So I think that this has to be treated like a serious crime. The Violence Against Women Act was the first time, it was a hard struggle, that domestic violence was treated like a crime. Oftentimes they said, well, that's just personal. You know, a cop would intervene, save someone being beat up on the street, but if there was a domestic fight, they wouldn't get involved. Well, that changed that whole landscape. And I see it all tied together, that if we can't stand up for our rights, the stories that I read almost daily about campus violence is enough to make you physically sick about the injustice of it. And so raising the awareness and doing something about it, both with legislation and putting sunshine, which we say is the best disinfectant on what is happening, hopefully we can change it. I thank Leslie, I thank President Obama for elevating the conversation, and all my colleagues in Congress. I believe we will pass the CASA Act with your help. Thank you for having me tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Maloney. That was very inspiring. Before we go on, as we must very quickly, I just want to say that a very smart attorney, probably one of the smartest in New York, who's sitting here, Ken Bloom, said to me, well, discuss the similarities and differences between accountability and sexual abuse in colleges and secondary schools. Because a lot of our focus, as I investigate Horace Mann with the help of the Horace Mann Action Committee, has been on younger and mostly boys, but starting before high school, and we'll be getting into that. But the main thing that they have in common is that the institutions, whether it be at colleges, universities, high schools, elementary schools, they have totally failed in this area. And what they have in common is the need for reform. Are there differences? Yes, but the similarities, the need for focus and reform is what ties this together, and you'll be hearing this during the course of the evening. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Marcy Hamilton. I think we'll just stay seated.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'd like to thank Judge Snyder, the Horace Mann Action Coalition, and the good people of the state of New York, many of whom are working for the protection of children. You know, I think that our Congresswoman has talked about some of the important issues that Congress has been willing to take up. I think they have agendas that they have not yet taken up at the federal level. One of the most important is the prevalence of summer camps on many university campuses involving sports. One of the prime areas where Jerry Sandusky was able to groom and find victims of abuse were at the football camps at Penn State. These camps are at many universities. Why? Because coaches make money. This is a way to make money in the summer. They are not regulated, and parents drop their children off thinking what could go wrong, and it is just a disaster waiting to happen. I kept waiting in the Penn State scandal for someone to start talking about reform and at least mandatory background checks. for these kinds of summer camps, and it hasn't happened yet. Because everybody thinks a university is where we only have adults, but we have a lot of children on university campuses. The other problem that we've encountered this year, or learned about this year, is the inadequacy of universities in responding to children. Well, I guess they're 18. I have a 19-year-old, so I call them children. But young adults showing up on college campuses who were sexually abused as children, and the inability of the college campus to respond and help those victims. So we have several schools in the United States where the response has been, don't tell anybody, and this is in the last several years, don't tell anybody because it will mean that you're a bad person, right? I thought we were past that era, but we are not. And so we are still working on the model for how to deal with abuse victims. And it makes sense that a child who's been sexually abused at home or in the schools, in the lower levels, goes to college and seeks some way to talk about it, to get help for it. Our colleges are not trained to be able to help them in the ways that they need that kind of help. So that's another victim universe that has yet to be fully addressed. And the third thing, and anybody who knows me knows this is my hobby horse. And I'm not gonna get statute of limitations yet, that's my second hobby horse. My first hobby horse is not one person, not a senator, not a representative, not a president in the United States has ever uttered the words clergy sex abuse. Ireland and Australia established government investigations of the institutional cover-up in religious organizations that we know is rampant. In the United States, not one word from Washington. That is a dereliction of duty of unbelievable proportions, and it has to do with the desire for votes, but I'll leave that hobby horse for now. Okay, so what is my favorite hobby horse on these issues? It is, how do we identify perpetrators? How do we figure out who at Horace Mann and who at Poly Prep and who at Yeshiva University where I teach and anywhere else, how do you know who the perpetrators are? So let me just go through the familiar types of regulation that we have had in the last 20 years where we're trying to work on the problem of abuse and assault. We have sex offender registries, right? Everybody's familiar with that. Megan's Law. We have done longer sentences. We've had proposals for GPS tracking of pedophiles. We have pedophile-free zones being fought over in various states. We have civil commitment, where a sex offender comes out of prison and then you can take them in and with a hearing put them in for civil commitment to keep them off the street. What do all of these have in common? Every one of these involve a perpetrator we already know. All of these rest on the assumption that you know the perpetrator. So how is it that we start to unmask the many hidden perpetrators who are capable of getting victim after victim because we have unwittingly set up a system that favors the predator and disfavors the victim? The primary technicality that's keeping most of these cases out of court is the statute of limitations. It is a simple procedural thing. It's just a technicality. But it is historically the primary means by which predators and pedophiles, who on average have about 100 victims over the course of their lives, this is how they operate. You sexually abuse the child, you threaten the child, either implicitly or explicitly, and then you hope that by the time the statute of limitations runs out, that the child hasn't told anybody. That bet is pretty good for the perpetrator, because on average, it takes decades for these victims to come forward. Why? Because you don't know when you're a child that what is being done to you is as criminal and wrong as it is. You don't know what it means to have no childhood or to have your childhood defiled until you're an adult and you can look back. If you have no way of escaping because you need shelter, food, education, you put up with it because that's the only way you're going to survive. So over 70% of abuse in this country occurs with either a family member or a close family acquaintance. And we have done a terrible disservice to survivors because in most states, until the last 15 years, we just shut off their claims. Originally, it was you had 2 years. Sexually abused at age 7, come forward at age 9. Then we pushed that up to age of majority plus that 2 years, age 20. But now we know, based on data that has been collected for a number of years, that most survivors are incapable of coming forward until their middle adult years, on average about age 42. So if you cut it off as we do in New York in the 20s, you don't get the vast majority. And what that means is we don't know who the vast majority of perpetrators are because the victim can't go to court and name them. If they can't go to court and name them, they're not going to name them otherwise because they'll be sued for defamation and they won't be able to have the resources to be able to guard against it. So how do we figure out the perps? In my view, we empower the survivors, we liberate their voices, and we do that by the simple expedient of eliminating the statute of limitations backwards and forwards. It's something that 10 years ago, if I had said that, every lawyer in the room would say, are you crazy? Now only about half do. But the point is, we have an uneven playing field right now. It favors the perpetrator. Now, New York is one of the worst states in the country. New York, Georgia, Michigan, and Mississippi, the worst states in the country that keep victims from court. But many states do not have very open statutes of limitations yet. And what that means is those secrets are bottled up, and those victims never get the opportunity for the legal system to say to them, it's not your fault. In the legal system, it's their fault. So if we're going to identify perpetrators, we have to do, to open up access to justice. And we have to do it because survivors need time. We have to do it because if we don't know who the predators are, they get more opportunities and they take them. And there's no age limit on being a predator. They'll abuse right up until their 80s. And finally, the only way to hold institutions accountable is when you start seeing the nests of perpetrators. And that's really what the Horace Mann investigation has revealed. Many institutions don't have one. It's not random. You have nests of perpetrators. And there's an unwritten code among them, and they operate to the detriment of our children. So, thanks very much.
Thank you. Let me add that Professor Hamilton has written an entire book on the need to eliminate the statute of limitations. It's called Justice Denied. It is very interesting, and I hope we can get into it a little more if we have time. Because it does talk about things like who the enemies of reform of the statute of limitations are. And of course, you can guess that the number one major enemy is the church, the Catholic Church, but there are others, and it's very, very interesting. Now, in New York, before we move on, I think it's important to say, and many of you who are interested in this area know, that the Markey bill has been pending in this state and has been passed by the state assembly, I think 5 times now. 4 or 5 times, and has yet to be allowed to come to the floor in the state Senate. I mean, none of this is surprising. On a national level, nothing gets done. On a state level, worse. We have even more corruption. But this has nothing to do with, well, it does have to do with possibly corruption in terms of lobbying by the church. But this Markey bill seeks to eliminate all statutes of limitation, both in civil and criminal matters. We already have no statute of limitations in New York as of 2006 for the top level felonies, crimes, Class B sex felonies. But in my view, and I'd like to hear Marcy on this briefly, I think that it is unlikely that we will ever get to the point of eliminating all statutes of limitations in New York but I think we could achieve realistically a modification that would be extremely helpful. And State Senator Klein has said that supposedly for the first time may allow this to come to the floor. We're all a little skeptical, but there's no question that one of the reforms we need to focus on is at least a major modification in the statute of limitations in New York. That legislation in an extreme form really is pending, but we must do something about that. Now, before we move on to what has really become my primary focus as investigating Horace Mann and a leading educator and expert in teacher sexual abuse, we are very fortunate to have with us tonight one of the worst examples of secondary school victims, survivors. He is willing to share briefly his story with us, and unfortunately, it's one of the worst I've ever heard, including all my work in sex crimes, but it is an example of the kind of thing that was happening constantly at Horace Mann, that is happening in almost every private school, as our survey of independent schools has shown. Nobody's willing to do anything about it until the press somehow reveals it, and then they have to focus on it. I will say that a number of schools have actually done something about it, a small handful, like Poly Prep and Yeshiva. They've put in a lot of stuff. Horace Mann, a couple of cosmetic changes, nothing substantive, and they've stonewalled the entire way. And one of their worst cases involves John Seiger. And John, thank you. If you would come up to the podium, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, I'd like to thank you for having me, and I'd like to thank you all for coming, and to everyone at HMAC who put this together. I've done this several times, pretty much because it needs to be done, and it never seems to get that much easier. But it's been very nice, first of all, just to hear all the proposals and the steps that need to be taken, because the worst part about it for me, and I'll describe some of it in a minute, is that it's still happening to kids, and they will have no resolution and no help and no voice, exactly as we had none, because there were no protections then. I'm 53 years old. I graduated from Horace Mann in 1979. And as you've heard, of course, Horace Mann is certainly not the only school that has had sex scandals, and I am not an expert on everything that's happened at every school, but I can tell you Horace Mann is certainly one of the most extreme examples by a huge margin, a factor of hundreds. Other schools have had one or two, or even a handful of abusers. Horace Mann had it well into the 20s of abusers. And they worked together. I went to, my first year at Horace Mann was in 7th grade. I was 11 years old, and about a month into the 7th grade, we had a class trip to Washington. And on the larger scale of things that happened to me, as you'll hear in a few minutes, that was one of the smaller, incidents as far as severity, but we were staying in motels there, and one of the teacher chaperones came in and sat on my bed and reached under my sheets and played with me and stuff like that, and I expressed my extreme displeasure, but this did not, abate his desire to continue that. I actually was in school in England as kind of an exchange student for 8th grade, so I had a rape-free year, which was really a delight. And then upon coming back to Horace Mann for 9th grade, I'm a professional musician, and one of the reasons I went to Horace Mann, although I was accepted at several schools, is because they touted their big maestro, Johannes Samari, who was good friends with at Yale, and they were roommates, R. Inslee Clark, our headmaster. And while Mr. Clark was very focused on baseball, he would occasionally lavish some attention on someone in theater or music if the great Johannes Samari would point them out. Of course, I've learned some of this in hindsight. And after one concert in 9th grade, Johannes took me aside and introduced me to Mr. Clark and said, "You should get to meet this up-and-coming musician. I think you'll enjoy spending some time with him." And of course, at 14, I didn't understand that that was going to be a bad thing. In fact, I thought, wow, that's pretty cool, And he said, why don't you come over to my house, which was right across the street from the school, on Friday after school. So I went over there, and he had, surprisingly, another English teacher there, Stan Copps. And they said, would you like something to drink? I'm like, sure, Coca-Cola would be great. And they gave me Coke with, rum in it, and a whole bunch. And then a second, and a third, and a fourth. And of course, by then I was feeling pretty drunk. And I said, well, I better go. No, let's get you some food. So they drove me downtown to 60th Street, where there was a hustler bar, and there was no food, just more drinks, and hired two male prostitutes, about 20 years old, and then took all of us back to the house again, and then more drinks, and then had them rape me in front of them, and then sent them off, and then took their turns with me. And that was the beginning of pretty much almost daily abuse through the end of 12th grade. I had, about a week after that first incident, Johanna Samari, the music teacher who had introduced me to R. Inslee Clark and indirectly to Stan Copps, had said, "Oh, I heard you had a wonderful time the other night. I heard all about it." And that alone, knowing that it was talked about and passed around at that age, was almost worse than what had happened itself. And then he started, and that went on for 3 years. As we went on, every summer would go off to Europe or other places to do concerts with the Glee Club and the chorus, and he would abuse me. And finding out in hindsight, plenty of my friends as well, and other students from years before and afterwards, and that would go on constantly. And there were days at school that I would have to have experiences, to put it mildly, with 3 or 4 teachers. There were some days it was only 1 or 2. Somehow I managed to get a relatively good education there in between rapes, but it was pretty much the music that kept me from not trying to kill myself too many times over the years, and I've managed not to. And it's through, you know, the group that we've gotten together that's been very helpful. Rather than go into too many more details, I'll share a few more cogent details and then a few thoughts. In a lot of other schools, there have been one abuser, a rogue, lone, under-the-radar person. And that, of course, can happen. If you are a pedophile, if you're an abuser and you want to be around kids, well, school's a pretty good place to go, unless you happen to be, you know, in the clergy. And that's another good place to go. But, so that can happen. And yes, a very skilled abuser is good at keeping it hidden and keeping the victims quiet. And this, of course, happens a lot. Now, I know we're not here specifically to talk about Horace Mann, but it is my frame of reference and my frame of experience, and unfortunately, one of the, absolutely, the most extreme example of secondary school sexual abuse that we know of to date. Just to let you know, including 7 teachers and the headmaster, I was abused at Horace Mann by 8 faculty members, in addition to concerts that they sent us off to and playing one Christmas party with at a monastery in which I got raped by 3 of the monks there, which was arranged by Johanna Samari. So that brings the Horace Mann or direct Horace Mann up to 11. And then Stan Copps, who had me go with grabbed me up after school on a different Friday and took me to a friend of his apartment and made me get naked and masturbate for them. And they took pictures, which they then threatened me with. Now there were a couple of the abusers there, Robert Berman and others. He would not only do sexual things, but also he couldn't enjoy himself unless he was beating you beforehand also, a whole other thing. But, and he acted as a lone wolf, so to speak, and there were a few others who were that way. But I can speak from my own personal experience, and, although I won't say any names, of course, some of my friends who I've heard their experiences too. At other schools, a lot of the abusers worked alone. And at other schools, some of them did work together. Not as many as at Horace Mann, but one of the things that is so pervasive is the covering up and the knowing that it's going on and allowing it to continue. Mr. Clark would never have met me if Johannes had not said, hey, here's this kid, and I know about his family life, and his father's out of the picture, and his mother's occupied with his brother who's got some problems, and this is a vulnerable kid, and you can take this one and use him. And then he and Mr. Copps did. And then Mr. Copps and his friends did. And then Johannes himself did. And then, although I had a very good piano teacher in the city who I liked very much, and she was great, he said, no, she's no good for you. You have to study with my friend here at Horace Mann, and that was Harris Goldsmith, who actually just died a couple of months ago. And he then, after about the 3rd lesson, and for the next 3 years, abused me at every lesson there too. So even the one thing in my life that was good for me, which was the music, got pretty much soured by that. And so it was a group of people that worked together and cornered people and put them in these positions and did that kind of thing. And I can assure you, the effect on my life was far more than just that. At 14, of course, that introduced me to prostitution. One of the guys that they got to rape me when I was 14, actually, just coincidentally, I ran into him a couple of blocks from where I lived on the east side and where my mother still lives. And he had apologized for that and said, hey, it was just business. And he got me involved in that business. And continuing through Mr. Clark, our headmaster, who used to hang out at the various East Side hustler bars, all through my high school years and after, and getting me involved in that, and of course drugs and booze, because my life was so miserable at the time. By the time I had graduated high school at 17 in 1979, I had had, in addition to the hundreds of thousands of rapes or forced sex directly by teachers and stuff, I had had paid sex and done porn films and stuff with at least 2,000 people. And that was about the legacy of education that Horace Mann gave to me. And so coming from that, and the lesson to take from this, at least for me, is that I really would like that not to have to happen to anybody else here forward. And if it does happen, at least that they can get a little bit of help and a little recourse. Everything that Leslie's described and Marcy, that they have described about the inability to go get help, or if you do go to get help, they tell you to be quiet, or they tell you to shut up. Or at Horace Mann, with many of the cases where people went and said what happened to them, they said, tell your son or tell your daughter, if they say another word about this, they're not going to get into a good college, and we'll find a way to kick them out of school, and your life will be over. We have the best and most powerful lawyers, and we can handle this. And I have to speak just a drop. I know, again, it's not about Horace Mann, but it's just too personal not to mention. The fact that the statute of limitations is so short in New York State, and the fact that abused people, and I can certainly speak as a living statistic, really don't even realize how bad it was. And are just, I can assure you, when any of us that I know, and I know a lot of survivors of abuse at Horace Mann and other places, when you get away from that, when you hit graduation day, you just want to say, let me forget about it for a while, and now let me have a little bit of a normal life. And it takes several years before you realize that still isn't happening because of the damage that was done to you. And then you go to do something about it, you finally get the courage to do something, and there is no place to turn. And the legal system says, hey, F you, because you didn't report it by the time you were 21. And let's face it, there are people from Horace Mann and plenty of other schools who had already killed themselves before they graduated. They never got a chance to even get to the statute of limitations. And as Leslie had mentioned, Horace Mann has been the most foot-dragging, most unapologetic, most uncaring school about this in any way. And they still have the nerve to say to the public and to their current parents and to the current students and to the world at large, the survivors are very happy with what we've done with them, and we've made great settlements, and everybody is happy, and aren't we wonderful? And I cannot presume to speak for every last survivor, but I can assure you, I know every survivor, at least every survivor is in our group, which is about 60-something, and I'm friends with more than half of them and have heard from more than the rest, and I can assure you that there is not one of us who is really happy with anything that the school has done. And they continue to do this, and the law is what lets them get away with it. The most painfully ironic part is that Horace Mann's motto is Magna est veritas et prevalet, which is great is the truth, it shall prevail. And unfortunately, that's only true if it doesn't hurt their image. And they've spent more money covering this up than they have to help anybody. And unfortunately, it's all too prevalent in other places. Anyway, thank you very much for your time and allowing me to share.
It is horrible to listen to that tale, and we're going to hear more about how John was really a very typical victim, I think, in many respects, from you, Dr. Shakeshaft, who is an expert in educator, sexual abuse, and misconduct.
I want to start by saying I use the language educator sexual misconduct because in schools, people want to discount things that are done to kids if it isn't seen as forced rape. And so the only way to get through to school people is to talk about a larger set of behaviors which form an enabling culture that allows lots to go on, and to say, this might not be criminal, but it's not what you want a teacher to do. So for instance, I've seen teachers who have forced students to masturbate in front of them get off because they didn't touch the student and made sure they didn't. And the school said, well, they never touched a student, so that doesn't really count. So I want to talk about the notion that this is a large set of behaviors that go on in schools. About 7% of students, according to the most recent data we have, and it's old, it's 2004, but we have no other data. About 7% of students, which is about 3.5 million students, report that they have been the target of physical sexual abuse by teachers. So that's 7% of our students. 10% of students report that they've had some kind of abuse by teachers that's sexual. It might be visual, meaning they were shown pornography. A teacher masturbated in front of them. A teacher got undressed in front of them. It might be verbal, talk, and again, visual movies and pornography, and it's physical as well. So 10% of kids have experienced some form of sexual misconduct that they didn't want. Because the study asked them, have any of these things ever happened to you? And it's a list of things that you didn't want to happen in schools. And originally the thought was that this was a study about kids. But what happened was they'd say yes, and then the interviewers of these 3,500 students across the United States would follow up with, well, when, where, what, who. And what they found out was, yeah, there's lots of peer sexual abuse in schools, but there's also adult to child sexual abuse in schools, and it was happening. Now, of those kids who said that this had happened to them, those 4.5 million kids, only 11% told anybody. So that's only 11%. And many of the students wouldn't have reported the abuse because they would have still been in the place where they thought that they were special, especially if they were high school students. They would have thought that they had been picked especially by a teacher, and only later do they come to realize that they had been abused and exploited. So we talk about a fairly large group of students in schools that have been sexually abused. We find a couple kinds of abusers in school. The majority of abusers are opportunistic abusers. They aren't pedophiles or fixated abusers. That is certainly a group of people, and certainly the group at Horace Mann falls into that category. So those are the people who are very careful. They think about what they're doing. They do a lot of grooming. They may pass kids around. They're also people who are often considered to be the best teachers in the school. And they work hard to be the best teachers in the school, because if you're the best teacher in the school, it's really hard for people to accuse you. And all the other kids who you don't abuse think you're fantastic, and so do their parents. And so nobody believes the kids who are going to come forward and talk about that teacher. So the fixated abusers tend to be really outstanding teachers. And what we found among those abusers are a disproportionate number of outstanding Teacher of the Year, Chamber of Commerce Teacher of the Year, State Teacher of the Year, National Teacher of the Year. All of those awards have a disproportionate number of people who've been sexual abusers. The opportunistic abuser is someone who will take anything they can get when it comes along. The fixated abuser more likely looks at elementary school kids and middle school kids, but also some high school kids, as you just heard, all the way through. The opportunistic abuser is more likely to look at middle school kids and high school kids. And so the opportunistic abuser may or may not be a good teacher, but mostly that opportunistic abuser is someone who's emotionally immature and identifies more with the kids than with the adults. They're sort of living their life through the kids. So they talk about the great music, and they use certain slang, and when they're going after somebody, whether it's a male to a female or a female to a male or male to male, female to female, it's a courtship. It's like a dating thing. Send them little notes, I really like you, you're really different than other kids, I find you very mature. Those kinds of things are what happens in those situations. And so what happens is a student says, well, I'm special. And often the kids who are targeted are vulnerable kids. All kids are vulnerable. Let's be clear. Every kid is vulnerable. But some kids may be more vulnerable than others. So for instance, a typical pattern among elementary school kids would go something like this. A male teacher decides to target a male student. And the way that person grooms the male student is through the male student's mother. Very often, that male student does not have an in-home dad. And so the teacher goes to the mother and say, you know, your son is really very special. You know, he's got some real talents, and he's struggling with them, but he's got some real talents. I'd really like to help him. The mom is like, thank God. You know, I've been worrying about my son having a good role model, and so here's one of the best teachers in the school has picked him out and says he has talent and he's smart and I can help him. Wow, you bet. And so the teacher grooms not only the child, saying you're special, we're going to have lessons, giving him presents, taking them to ball games, taking them hunting is a big thing. It seems odd in New York City, but across the country it's a big thing, going to hunting and fishing lodges. And the child feels special. And so far, all that's happening is help. Then pretty soon it changes. And at that point, because it's incremental, and that's what grooming is, it's incremental. It's one thing, and then a hand here, and a hug here, and a touch here, and a pull down pants here. Soon the child believes that it's their fault. If they would only have said no in the beginning, this little 7-year-old, if they only would have stopped them when they put the arm around this little 10-year-old, then this wouldn't have happened. And so the child believes that he or she is responsible for this behavior. They also care about this person a lot, because this person has spent a lot of time with them and has showered them with attention, very often something they weren't having. And so they have this relationship where they really love the person and they hate what's being done to them. And they also have no voice, have no power, and feel they're at fault. And if they tell, they'll get in trouble. And the abuser encourages that kind of thinking. So that's some of the patterns that go on in elementary, middle school. High school patterns are more often either sort of forced sex, and if you tell, you know, I won't pass you, or I'll tell them you did this to me, and who's going to believe you? Especially when one of the patterns is to make sure they give the students alcohol or drugs, and then they hold the alcohol or drugs over the student and say that if you tell, I'm going to talk about how you use these things, and I'm going to tell them X, Y, Z, which isn't usually true, but they'll believe me. The other is then just the romantic, quote unquote, pursuit of someone, whether it's a female teacher to a male, or a male teacher to a female student. Or a male student, and it's notes, it's cards, it's gifts, it's I love you, it's texts, it's really stuff that when you read it, you can't even believe an adult would talk like that, because it's so adolescent. But these are adults who are really going back and living an adolescent experience. Finally, I just want to say that in the schools, what we have is an enabling culture. Most of the teachers, when they find out that somebody has sexually abused, it's a coach or a teacher or some other person employed by the school, they say things like, the first thing they usually say is, it can't be true, I don't believe it's true. Even when the person admits it, they say, he didn't really do it. He's just saying that to spare his family. They hear that all the time. But even when they finally believe the person did it, they say, well, you know, I suspected something was odd, but I didn't really, you know, think much about it. I mean, she was always in the room with those football players with the door shut, or he was always alone with the little kids. They don't speak up, never speak up. And when you say, why didn't you say something? The teachers will say this, well, if I was wrong, I would have ruined the career of a good teacher. I have yet to hear a professional in education say, if I was right I would have saved that child. They don't. They only think of adults. And so that's part of the enabling culture.
And also, Marcy has written that one of the major blocks against reform of, for example, statute of limitations is teachers' unions.
Teachers' unions are big. And I'll have to say, I'm a Democrat, but my own party has done very little about this because they court the teacher vote. The Republicans have done the most. They've done it for bad purposes because they want to, defame teachers. So it's this kind of funny thing where they're using this to be able to say things about teachers and reduce education funding. But
Right,
I
but
have-
at the same time, the Republicans all block statute of limitations
that's right.
reform.
That's right. They do.
Well, that's often because of the groups
When
we've talked about.
when I say the Republicans have done something, I don't mean they've done very much. I don't want to be misunderstood here.
I asked Dr. Shakeshaft, as an expert in this field, to prepare for us, and this could go on forever, but to briefly, and we have the only PowerPoint of the night, which hopefully Rob can get up for us, because he's the technical guy, I'm not. What are the 10 approximately most important things that we need to do going forward? And I'd like to have more time to talk about this. I don't know if we will, but let's at least get you to come up and talk. Whoops, well, so far he said you have to point at something. Oh, here's James. James, thank you. The technical expert. Why don't you discuss those, please?
Okay, well, for me, the number one thing is training. If we teach the observers, if we teach other teachers what to look for, what the red flags are, and if we promote and build a culture where you will report, you will not let these things go by, we are more likely to get to stop a lot of the abuse. Teachers, parents, and kids, we need to be really training them about what's acceptable, what's not, and what to do when you see this happening. So what if you're wrong? I'd rather err on the side of trying to keep a kid safe. You smell smoke, you might say, I'm not going to pull the fire alarm because, I might be wrong. No, you pull the fire alarm, and if you're wrong, you say, gosh, I'm sorry, but I was worried because I smelled smoke. So the second is in interviews. We don't interview very carefully. We don't ask pointed interview questions. When we call up references, we don't say, why is this person leaving? We don't say, were there ever any allegations about sexual abuse or any other kinds of abuse? We don't ask direct questions. We also always call up the people they put on the recommendation form. Well, you need to go a little farther than that. You need to wonder why the principal wasn't called up on the form. You need to really do real background checks, not only with fingerprints and criminal background checks, which really don't turn up many teachers, but background checks in terms of how they were in their other area. What I found in looking at over like 300 different specific cases is the hiring and background questions and interviews of the people who've worked with them before are very poorly done. Training I did, develop a system. What happens in schools is there'll be an allegation, and the principal might say, the principal calls in the teacher and says, did you do this? The teacher says, no. The principal says, I investigated, it didn't happen. Well, of course, we know that's a bad investigation, and they shouldn't do that. But if you keep a record of the allegations, what you generally find is that this teacher had allegations against them 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 1 year ago, and nobody keeps the records in the same place. So you can't go back to find that information. You can't see the patterns that are coming up. And so we need to have policies about specific educator sexual misconduct, what can and can't be done. It needs to be in the policy. That doesn't mean people will follow the policies, but in schools, that's the first way to start. You must write it down. You can't just have a policy that there will be no inappropriate behavior. That's just not specific enough for too many people. And kids need to be able to read those policies and see, wait, it says here that a teacher can't do this to me. Oh, it's written down. That's wrong. And so those are some of the things that I would suggest.
Thank you so much. There's a lot more, but I want to move on right now. Before I turn to Dick Condon, who is the special commissioner of investigations for the public school system of New York City, I just want to point out one thing I think is extremely shocking, and that is there is no law in the entire state of New York which covers private school sexual abuse. Private school. There is a law which covers abuse by parents or guardians, which includes sexual abuse, that does cover private schools. But that's only by parents or guardians or a person legally responsible for the child. It does not cover teachers. It does not cover staff. It doesn't cover coaches. It doesn't cover volunteers. And for this state to be in a situation where really private schools are basically totally unregulated is shocking and should not be tolerated. Now, in contrast to that, we have a wonderful system, relatively speaking, so I don't want to give you too much praise there, Dick, who we've known each other about 40 years. And Dick's background makes him the perfect person to be a totally independent and incredibly smart investigator, because he was a top-level police person, including being the acting commissioner of the entire New York City Police Department, as you heard. But what's wonderful about his position, which only regulates New York City public schools, is that it's worked better than anything else, I think, that I know of so far, and maybe there are other places in the United States, but I don't think so. So I'd like us to hear from Dick as to what his system is, how it works both administratively and in terms of criminal cases, and maybe we'll get some good ideas from this. Dick?
Good evening. Before I begin my prepared remarks, let me talk a little bit about what the professor talked about, and that's when it comes to grooming. And what we've found in New York City, and I've been doing this for 12 years now, is that the tool that helps these perpetrators to groom children more than any other is the cell phone. The cell phone changed the way the world of the schools actually exists. Think back 15 years ago, and you're a father or mother of a student, and a teacher starts calling every evening and wants to talk to that student. By the time the second or third phone call has happened, you have your suspicions. You want to know why this is going on. But what happens now is the child, the student, has his own cell phone. And we've had cases where if the child didn't have a cell phone, the groomer would buy the child a cell phone. So the parents didn't even know that the child had a cell phone. Or if they knew about the cell phone, they never looked to see what calls were going on. What calls were going on at 3 o'clock in the morning, or on Sundays or Saturdays coming from teachers. So the cell phone, to my way of thinking, is probably the biggest aid to these people that exist. But fortunately, it's also the biggest way that we prove that they're conducting these kinds of behavior. We get the cell phone records, and we can confront them with the fact that they're making these phone calls to this student at all these hours of the day and night, weekends and things like that. And even if we can't prove the sexual crime or sexual misconduct, we can get them terminated just for inappropriate conduct. And that's one of the things that the professor was talking about, and it's really a very important thing. But let me talk a little bit about the office. Back in the late 1980s, there were widespread allegations of corruption in the New York City Board of Education. And the internal inspector general, who oversaw investigations in the Department of Education, they were totally inept. And no one was reporting misconduct, particularly sexual misconduct involving students. So the mayor, who was then Ed Koch, and the president of the Board of Education, Bobby Wagner, and his chancellor, Joe Fernandez, they formed the Joint Commission on Integrity in Public Schools. And that commission made a number of findings. One finding was that the internal inspector general was totally inept and should be replaced by an outside entity that was independent of the Board of Education. And my office is independent of the Board of Education. I'm a commissioner in the Department of Investigation. The chancellor has no authority over me. In fact, I have a good deal of authority over everyone in the school system. They have to produce any records that I want. They have to come and take testimony, testify under oath if we see fit to have them testify under oath. We can get any records that they have. So we have a lot of authority over them. And the way that happened was that in June of 1990, Mayor Dinkins formed this new organization and called it, at that time it was a Deputy Commissioner of Investigation for New York City Schools, but the first Deputy Commissioner of Investigation didn't feel that that title was worthy of him. So he made, the mayor actually put out an order changing the title to Special Commissioner of Investigation for New York City Schools. And that's the position I hold. In July of 2002, the Board of Education actually came under the city's mayor for the first time. Before that, the Board of Education was not a city agency. And Mayor Bloomberg, who was the mayor at that time, he appointed me as special commissioner. And I have a staff of 65, including 5 attorneys, all of whom are former prosecutors in Manhattan DA's office and the Queens DA's office. Leslie from the Manhattan DA's office. And I have some 50 investigators, all of whom, or almost all of whom, are former detectives who were assigned to special victims when they were working in the police department. You know, what we do now, of course, is we have to have 1 or 2 young people, because when they start talking about the different kinds of social media, all of a sudden you see all the old detectives rushing up to 20-year-old kids trying to find out what they're talking about. We have a lot of authority, but I'm really only going to talk about sexual misconduct because that's pretty much what tonight is about. And in our world, sexual misconduct includes all the sex crimes in the penal law and any other inappropriate behavior or comments of a sexual nature, including inappropriate emails, internet use, texting, or other social media communication. We have 1 team of 12 investigators, including 7 who were sex crime investigators in the New York City Police Department, and I handle all of our sexual misconduct investigations. And let me say that everyone at the Board of Education, the Department of Education, is a mandated reporter. They are required to report any incidents of sexual misconduct. And if the conduct is criminal, they also have to report it to the police department. And we will charge, and we have charged, DOE employees who did not report instances of sexual misconduct when we can prove that they didn't do it. In a 12-year period from 2002 to 2013, the number of complaints that describe some sort of sexual misconduct has fluctuated from a low of 435 complaints in 2004 to a high of 679 complaints in 2012. And this year, we'll monitor last year, and last year's complaints were about 500 and some odd. We investigate a higher percentage of sexual misconduct allegations than any other allegation. And since 2005, we have monitored all the sexual misconduct arrests made by the police department and prosecutions that involve student victims. And the reason we do that is because if the district attorney fails to prosecute, or if the prosecution fails, and there are a lot of reasons why this happens. Children don't want to testify, their parents don't want them to testify. We have children coming from all over the world and they go back to the countries that they came from, or they go on to college and they just don't want to be involved in the criminal prosecution. But if the criminal prosecution fails, then we will open an investigation and we will see if using the same facts we can get a misconduct complaint made. And if we can get this person terminated, even though we can't prove a criminal case. Last year, we investigated 124 such cases. These were just cases where the police had made an arrest, so there was at least the feeling that a crime had been committed, and the DA had either tried to prosecute it or didn't prosecute it because he didn't feel he had enough evidence. So we took 124 of those cases last year, and we substantiated 42 of them. That was 42 more people who should not have been in the Department of Education, who we were able to have them terminated. We don't have to prove a crime. We just have to establish that the adult's behavior was both inappropriate and serious, and we can recommend termination.
That's by preponderance of the evidence.
Yes.
As
yes.
opposed to
We,
beyond a reasonable
in
doubt.
fact, the union in 2005 agreed that if we put out a report and the preponderance of the evidence showed sexual misconduct, they could have an immediate hearing before an arbitrator. And if the arbitrator upheld our finding, then the teacher could be suspended. He had to be tried within 2 months. And the arbitrator, if he was convicted of sexual misconduct, the arbitrator had no penalty that he could impose other than termination. He couldn't say, well, yes, it was sexual misconduct, but it's not, we don't have
You
to
said
terminate it.
convicted, but you mean found responsible
Found
in the
responsible,
administrative
yeah,
hearing?
Yes, yeah. Over the past 12 years, we have substantiated roughly 75 sexual misconduct cases every year. And that's about 37% of the cases that we actually investigate. And we had a case actually just this year where the police department was unable to make a case that the prosecutor would prosecute. And it involved 3 8-year-old girls who had been sexually abused by a after-school worker. So we took that case with the idea, well, let's see if we can, prove that he did this. And the 2 detectives who went out, who were former sex crime investigators, and they actually went to the guy's home and they spoke to him outside of his home. And he actually confessed to what he was doing, that he was sexually abusing these girls. And show you how sick it is, these 8-year-old girls, and he told us that he abused the one girl more than the other 2 girls because she was more his type. And this is an 8-year-old girl that we're talking about. So we went and got the detective who had the original investigation, and we brought her with us, and we got him to confess to her, and then we got him to videotape the confession, and now he's been indicted and hopefully will be convicted. Our investigations usually consist of interviews and subpoenaed documents. Subpoenaed documents are normally phone records. That's the best thing we have going for us. And we also obtain other social media records when they exist and are available. Our investigations usually begin with a complaint made by a school official. We get a lot of complaints from school officials. And they have received a complaint either from a student, when it comes to young girls who are involved with teachers or guidance counselors or other people. Usually it's the girl's best friend in school who tells someone in the school that this is going on. With boys, who are with a woman teacher, they tell everyone that they can find. They stop people on the street and tell them that this is going on. There was one arrest just yesterday out in Staten Island, and when they interviewed the boy, who was 16, he said, well, I only told my best friend. But then I told a couple of other people, too. So, I mean, we don't have too much trouble getting information when the boy is having an affair with a teacher. And let's see. We even get complaints, and you were talking about statute of limitations, and we get complaints from both male and female adults who are complaining about something that happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and it's finally come to the point that they want to talk about it, And we'll open those investigations and we'll see what we can find out, at least substantiate that it could have happened. And the school did exist, that the teacher name was in that school, that the classroom where it took place existed, things like that, we can't do anything with it other than make sure that that person, we can get them terminated if they're still in the school. But if they're gone, we can keep them from coming back, but that's all we can do. We can't do anything criminally. Let me see what else. If the case is substantiated, it then goes to an attorney. The investigator does the investigation. Usually we have 2 investigators on every investigation so that you have witnesses to what's been said. If they substantiate the case, they write up a closing report. It'll then go to one of the attorneys in the office, and they will look at everything that the investigator has uncovered. If it's not enough, they will send the investigators out again to see if they can get more evidence or get different types of evidence. If it is enough, the attorney will write a report substantiating the case. If my first deputy commissioner will look at it, I'll look at it, and if we approve it, then we will send it to whatever authority. We'll send it to the chancellor, because the person's an employee of the Department of Education. We'll send it to a prosecutor, if it's criminal, the prosecutor will take it. And we will send it to the New York State Department of Education, so that they have this information on this particular teacher. And the only other thing I would say is that in 2013, we recommended termination or its equivalent of the subject of the investigation in 138 cases, many of them involving sexual misconduct. The Department of Education, I have to say, almost always accepts our findings, and they always attempt to terminate someone if that's what we've recommended. Now, we don't investigate students, nor do we do background investigations of employees. Department of Education does its own investigation of potential employees, and they do, of course, New York State and FBI fingerprinting. And then they do some other extensive background investigation. That's
Okay,
it.
oh,
Thank
that's
you.
fascinating, and I want to say two things. One, I was intrigued by the fact that your authority basically comes from the chancellor's regulations, right?
Well, his regulations apply to his people,
Oh,
saying that
not
they
your
have to.
authority, I'm sorry.
No,
I
my,
mean
my authority
I beg your
comes
pardon, I put
from
that
an
wrong.
executive order of the
Right,
mayor,
but
yeah.
in terms of, the chancellor has regulated this whole area of sexual
Yes,
abuse.
yes.
And as you said, everyone's a mandated reporter in the public school
Mhm.
system. There are two things that I think we should learn from this, I mean, many more, but two. Number one, everyone in every school, public and private, should be a mandated reporter. That is not true. It isn't true at all in private schools. And number two, why can't we have a state position like Dick Condon's that applies to every public and private school statewide and set up similarly? They'd have to find someone as independent as you and with your experience, Dick. But I think it is a very important thing for us to, when we're talking about statute of limitation modification, when we're talking about mandatory reporting, we're talking about having a position like yours, we can make a real difference if we focus on things like that, in addition, of course, to all the things that you pointed out and many more that we don't have time to get into. I want to move to Stephanie Nilva, who is running a unique program in New York City, one that we hope will get duplicated. And I first met Stephanie when the program was not in its infancy, but it was a while.
A couple years old,
And
maybe,
it's
toddler.
It's grown so much and been so successful. I went into the public schools to see Stephanie and her people work, and it's really impressive. And it's a prevention program, and will you talk about it, Stephanie?
Okay. So Day One is the only organization in New York that focuses its resources fully on the issue of teen dating violence. So if this is the first time you're hearing the words dating violence in your life, it's just think domestic violence among a younger age group. And what Day One targets is youth up to the age of 24. We work with high school students and college students. And what I'm going to be talking about is intimate partner violence. I may abbreviate to IPV. What I mean by that is not perpetrated by a professional or a family member, strictly between intimate partners, think boyfriend, girlfriend, et cetera. What Day One does is deliver preventive programs in schools, high schools, and at college level, and talks to young people about what the warning signs of abuse are, how to get help, what the legal resources available are, et cetera. If someone is in an abusive situation, we're going to provide direct services. So they may get counseling from an individual, by individuals, in individuals, or as an individual or in groups. They may also receive legal assistance. We have lawyers on staff. They may need a protective order. Or if they have a child in common with the abusive party, then maybe they're getting a custody order to build a safer environment for that family. We also provide training for adults so that professionals can identify dating violence issues in their midst, and also policy advocacy and technical assistance for other organizations or institutions. What I'm finding is the theme among all the survivors that are coming up this evening is there are three things that could make a difference to all of these survivors, whether we're talking about intimate partners or victims of sexual abuse by whether it's family members or professionals and so on, and that's policy change, prevention, and direct services for survivors. I'll start with direct services because it's the most obvious. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, but I just want to point out that services, making sure that services are publicly available, that you've got a statement that we have these services out there, is going to indicate to the community that this behavior is not acceptable. In theory, that accountability will take place. And it will also have the effect of reducing reoccurrence of abuse and or continued abuse of a survivor due to introducing services that might consist of what we call safety planning, so developing a safety mechanism or system for somebody who maybe still is in a relationship with the abuser or is subject to the abuser or is at risk because they're ending a relationship, which is the most dangerous time when you're separating from an abusive partner. So I want to move on to policy because that's something that can make such a gigantic difference, again, in all of these areas. But I'm going to speak again specifically about our area, which is intimate partner violence. I want to start with mentioning a 2008 study that found that youth who received comprehensive sex education used, meaning perpetrated, significantly fewer acts of violence against a dating partner by the end of 11th grade. So education matters, awareness matters. Introducing this information, prevention, knowledge is going to make a difference to all of these cases. And again, to extrapolate to everything from the NFL to what's going on in colleges and so on. There's so much we could be doing earlier. It's also been documented that introducing education of any kind addressing intimate partner violence will reduce the occurrence of dating violence among teens. Because of these issues, states have begun to legislate the introduction of prevention programs in schools all across the country. So states like Rhode Island and surprisingly Texas and a few others are mandating domestic violence education or healthy relationships education in schools. Some are recommending it instead of mandating it. But this is a little bit of a movement that you're seeing in other states. Day One has advocated for that sort of legislation in New York State. There have been bills that have floated around. They don't really get anywhere based on usual suspicion that they would cost too much. What we would want to see is age-appropriate healthy relationships education, K through 12. Day One does our prevention in high schools, and sometimes people say to me, you're getting there so early. We're not. We need to be starting younger. We need to be talking to young people about body image, about using words instead of their hands, about all sorts of things that can prevent all of these issues going forward. You may be aware that, especially with all the attention that's been going on related to college campuses, New York State has taken a lot of steps. Governor Cuomo just passed a resolution that would require the SUNY system-wide, to have uniform practices related to sexual assault on campus. The details around that are going to have a uniform definition of consent, an immunity policy, which is going to protect and encourage survivors to come forward, statewide training for campus police and administrators, a public awareness campaign, and a victim's bill of rights, which would notify them that they can get legal help if they chose to go through the legal system. I want to move on and talk about prevention directly for a few minutes. So Day One sees about 4,000 young people in New York City high schools and on the fewer end in colleges, but up to college level. And we're delivering workshops that address everything from sexual assault. We have a workshop called Consent and Coercion, the kind of subtle areas around sex assault. Even if you have a health class that's teaching you how to put on a condom, it's not necessarily going to tell you what to do if your partner refuses to use one. So those are some of the things that we're bringing up in classrooms. We have a workshop called Let's Talk About Sext. So I'm so glad to hear the commissioner talking about cell phones, bringing up technology. Technology abuse is ubiquitous among our client age group. So everything from sexting to invasions of privacy, social sabotage, harassment, all of these things happening online. And we also have to stay very up to date, and I keep a very young staff for that reason. The reason I bring up this range of workshops is also to make sure that when we talk about preventive programs and delivering, mandating, for instance, if we could do that, statewide preventive education, we need to talk about what is the content of that education going to look like. It can't include just intimate partner violence. It can't be just about sexual assault. It has to include all those things. It has to talk about technology abuse and all the issues that I just listed. All of those things are going to make a difference. All of those things are inroads to what can become increasing amounts of physical or sexual assault. It's also not sufficient to just educate youth. We need to educate professionals. We need to make sure that a guidance counselor in a school, and this is a true story, doesn't say something like, well, if you didn't wear your skirt so short, he wouldn't be so angry. And that's a well-intentioned person, right? But that is also somebody who is maybe going to ensure that that young person never comes forward again because they feel that they are controlling the problems, they are to blame, and they can fix the problem themselves as opposed to the fault lying with the abuser. We want to train all the professionals in schools, not just the guidance counselors. You don't know who a young person is going to disclose to. They're going to disclose to their favorite teacher, their coach, their music teacher. You don't know. But if that person comes forward, that needs to be somebody who is knowledgeable and understanding and knows where to get the right help. You don't know who's going to either be the subject of a disclosure or who's going to witness it. One of the things Day One has done is work with the NYPD to talk about training the school safety officers, because there are officers in every school, in the public schools, and those are the people that are hanging around in the front of the schools. They get to know the students really well. They're going to be seeing issues of abuse or issues of harassment that can increase over time, and they're in a position to make a difference. Beyond just workshops, we have to talk about the environment of schools as a whole. And this brings up the bystander things that have been touched on. We want to make a safe environment with a reduced or minimized tolerance for violence. We want to make sure that there are posters on the walls, not just posters talking about teen pregnancy. Everybody sees those. In fact, they don't even see them anymore because they're everywhere. But we don't have posters around dating violence. Young people don't have the language to identify the issue, and they don't have information saying it's a problem, so they don't even know to come forward. So you want PSAs out there. You want information that is going to equip everyone, because each person is a potential bystander. One study found that in dating abuse instances, 40% of girls and 49% of boys said that there was someone else present when the abuse occurred. And yet, the acceptance by peers of abusive behavior is one of the strongest indicators of later dating violence. So we need to make sure that people are trained not just to identify what's happening around them with their peers, but also how to step forward, how to make a difference, how to say something, and also how to do it safely, which is particularly important. But we need to make sure that someone saying, dude, that's not okay, to their teammate can happen, because that's unbelievably powerful. It really makes a difference. I want to move on just to talk about what institutions are doing that is right and wrong. I sometimes feel sympathetic because institutions didn't foresee these issues. I'm thinking about the courts. My background is as a lawyer, and courts didn't conceive of dating abuse. They didn't set up their programs and services so that, assuming that minors would be there addressing this issue. So you've got inconsistent experiences by young people coming forward and being told, you can't be here without a parent. You need a guardian ad litem. You need somebody to speak for you. And that's still among the judges, right? There's inconsistency. And then you add in the clerks, who can be the first line, who can just turn someone away entirely. Now, if somebody in a courthouse tells a teenager, yeah, I don't think you can be here unless your parent's here, that teenager's not coming back, and they're going to tell all their friends they're not allowed to be there. So you have to make sure that those institutions are prepared, are gearing up, are understanding of this age group and the issues that are presented by them. As another example, we've been meeting with the NYPD on other issues related to domestic incident reports. So a DIR is something that police issue in every case of domestic violence, whether it happens on a street corner or in somebody's home. And we said, the school safety officers, who are police officers, don't issue these DIRs in schools. And I sat there in a room with somebody that entirely intimidated me, a captain in the police force, who said, oh, I don't know why we're not doing that. We should be doing that. We should issue DIRs in schools. And it's just another example of the fact that people aren't conceiving of this issue in that setting. So I want to wrap up by I just want to touch quickly on mandated reporting. Which is just to point out that the Department of Education is not a mandated reporter in dating violence issues. And it's an interesting point because we want young people to be able to be safe, survivors to be safe, and that may not include reporting to ACS or somebody else that there is a problem going on. So I'll save I was going to tell us a quick case example that Day One is having in schools, unless I can do that. I'll save it, okay.
Because there's so much to get into,
Yeah.
and we are running out of time, and I've got to get to Professor Guggenheim, and I'm going to do that in a second. The use of technology in schools is such an important topic, and we really can't get into it because our time is almost up. But it's interesting, I think, that in the New York City public schools, as I understand it, Dick, correct me if I'm wrong, if you know this, teachers are barred from contacting students on websites like Twitter and Facebook, but there's nothing addressing their contact by text message or cell phone, which of course gives you a lot of evidence, which I find very strange. But then we also have something we can't get into, which are all the First Amendment issues, where some courts have said that basically sexual kinds of communication are protected by the First Amendment. And I don't think this issue has been decided by the U.S. Supreme Court yet, and maybe it will be. But we can, if we have time, we'll come back to it. Professor Guggenheim is a leading expert in the field of children's rights. But we asked him to be here because I know he's going to be a somewhat perhaps of a dissenting voice to some of the things that have been said in this sense. I don't know how many of you follow in the paper that a group of Harvard professors have recently, the other day, objected to the new Harvard sexual abuse policy on the grounds that it's unfair to the accused. Also, a group of professors, or I should say lawyers, who I don't think they're professors, but have filed objections with, I don't know if it's the Justice Department or the Senate, in terms of the same kind of issue, in terms of the CASA bill, which we hope will get passed to regulate accountability, transparency, training, and really help victims. And there's no question that the rest of us up here are totally victim-oriented, although it's really important to have a balanced system, one that's fair to both sides. So I think your comments, Professor, are particularly important at this point.
Well, I may disappoint you. The problem for me is we talked about so many issues tonight, and they don't tie together quite as neatly for me as they may perhaps for the rest of the panel. The one thing I'm most interested in reacting to is the astonishingly sad story that we heard that happened in the 1970s in Horace Mann that leave me without breath. And what I want to ask is, what's wrong with us? What is wrong with us? And by asking that question, I'm not talking about the criminals who behaved as they did in the name of being educators. They are manifestly people who deserve to be punished. But what's wrong with us that we live today in 2014 in a city with an institution that continues to deny and gets away with it? So we have a U.S. News and World Report ranking that, why isn't this on it? Why isn't a school's commitment to the well-being of its children something that we demand? Why isn't it a tort for a corporate board of an educational system, of a school, to lie to an alumni, to an alumnus about past behavior? Why isn't that a current tort? What's wrong with us? How could it be that we continue to send our children to schools? Who's worse? I think the denier. And that's all I'm going to say tonight.
Okay, well, you wanted to respond to that.
Well, I just have a two-word response, and I think that it was already touched on, and that is, and this is a lousy phrase, but I haven't come up with a better one in 15 years. We engage in adult preferentialism. We prefer adults.
Yep.
I had last year, an entire board of a major newspaper sit there and tell me that we don't want statute of limitations reform because they knew of two men who were falsely accused, each by 4 children. I said, if there are 4 children, I'm not buying the false part. And they said, it's unjust to have these cases last too long. We prefer adults, and until we turn that around, it's gonna be very hard.
Well, I think we should say that it is very important, I mean, this is my view. I've always been a victim advocate, and I'll continue to be, but I want to have a fair system. Obviously, the accuser has to have rights, as do the accused, has to have rights, as does the accuser. One of the interesting things about CASA, incidentally, Martin, is that it will force, under Title IX and the Clery Act, every college and university, but not secondary schools, which it has nothing to do with, to have a report, an annual report, a survey, which will show an anonymous survey,
Right.
which will,
That's a great step forward.
every student will be asked to fill out anonymously a survey, which will talk about what has happened to him and her, and the university will be forced to be totally transparent,
Right.
or their funding will be in jeopardy to a much greater extent than has happened in the past, where it's been a slap on the wrist.
Exactly.
But, I mean, the CASA bill provides a lot more than that, but that's one thing I think is extremely
so
important.
If you want me to be controversial, on the statute of limitations.
Why not?
You know, we ought to remember, or somebody ought to tell you why we have statutes of limitations. We have them because there is a sense in a society of reaching a stage when matters that once happened can't be revisited. And that's not to protect bad people. It's for a fair sense of repose. But it's also, you know, one of the things that stunned me after 9/11 were the people who came forward and falsely reported that they were victims of the attack when there was this giant fund. Now, let's not kid ourselves. There will be people who will take advantage of being able to say, 40 years ago, something happened to me, when it is impossible to disprove that.
Well, Martin, I think,
Statistically,
yes,
that's not true.
statistically, it is an extraordinarily small number. That's what, that is what has been shown. And yes, there's a desire for society to have finality in all matters, but the problem is, in the area of sexual predators, as we've heard from all the experts, only 10% of those who've been sexually abused as children particularly ever come forward. We don't know about 90% of them. And the people who do come forward often don't come forward until they're adults and realize they're not alone, this has happened to other people, and they finally come to grips with it, right or wrong.
No, people make up slip and falls, and they make up anything to get into a large fund. But statistically, they don't make up being sexually violated as a child.
And they're not pilloried in the same way if they do. Yeah.
They do.
Okay, I think we've reached the point where I want, before we open this for any Q&As, and before I make a few concluding remarks, I want to ask each of the panelists, I think it's a difficult question. If you had one reform that you could put in place, and there are many that obviously we all feel strongly about, what would that one reform be that you think going forward would make the most difference? And I'll start with you.
Oh, I already said it. Healthy relationships education starting from kindergarten.
Same thing, required education that includes
Yeah.
educator sexual misconduct starting from kindergarten.
And along the lines of training, I would just say that, again, let's emphasize, training that's age appropriate for students starting at an early age, training for parents so that they are aware of what to look for, training for teachers, staff, volunteer, anyone who ever is going to come into contact with our children, who are more important to us than anyone else.
This will be shocking. I would eliminate.
Don't surprise us.
No, I won't. I would eliminate the statute of limitations in the way that Minnesota and Delaware have, which is complete elimination going forward, criminal and civil, and combined with that, a revival so that those who have expired statutes. And in those states, we've seen extraordinary justice. So.
All right, Dick?
New York City teachers are the only government employees that I know of in the United States that do not have to answer questions about their job. If we have something happen in a school, a kid gets hurt, beaten up, something like that, you can call these teachers in and they can just say, I'm not gonna talk to you. No other group can do that.
Well, Martin?
Tight regulation of all educational institutions, that they have to have an ombudsman or an independent investigator or some process by which it would be illegal to turn away the complainant.
That's great. You are our moral compass here, Martin. And shall we open it up briefly for questions, and I'll make a few concluding remarks.
Thank you. And thank you all for being up here, and thank you, Carolyn Maloney, for being here as well. I appreciate everybody and all of you being here. My name's Tim Walsh. I'm a survivor of sexual abuse, both inside and outside of the Catholic Church, public. The sexual abuse of children isn't and shouldn't be called sexual abuse. Let's start with that. It's rape, R-A-P-E. It's the rape of the child physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally. Tonight we heard the rape of children being termed as sexual misconduct. There are other institutions that would like to call it inappropriate touching. We need to get over that, get beyond it, and see it for what it really is.
Do you have a question for us, sir? I don't want to interrupt you, but we don't have time, you know.
We inform perpetrators of their rights. Why do we not inform the victims of theirs?
Thank you.
It's just what I'd like to know. Thank you, Marcy.
Tim is one of the most active advocates for SOL reform in the state of New York.
And that's admirable, but I had to cut you off. Just one area I think we should touch upon before I conclude, which is, you know, what are some of the things are there other things that we need to talk about briefly in terms of going forward? The really important idea of having a symposium like this, and we can only touch upon the issues, as you can see, is what are we going to do to change things? We've already mentioned a lot of issues like the mandatory training. We've seen things in the CASA bill that will be helpful. Many more rigorous checks and balances and investigations about hiring, all age-appropriate training for everyone, as I mentioned a minute ago and everyone else has mentioned, an annual review of procedures by every school and college, a report that's going to be published on websites. I'd like to see and none of these things cost a lot of money. I'd like to see a psychologist consultant to every school, not on a major retainer, but a lot of people will do this pro bono, as virtually all of us are, and that person is available for crisis intervention. That person is available to link a victim of child sexual abuse to a therapist or to whomever is appropriate or helps with counseling. I'd like to see a national registry of teachers who have been found either responsible administratively for sexual abuse or guilty of a crime. Of course, you can find out if they've been convicted of a crime. I think it's extremely important that every applicant for any kind of a teaching or related school and any contact with children job have to show that they still have a valid license. And in addition to the fact that these recommendations that they get, which are often like one line saying someone worked here from here to there, people don't want to answer what happened, is what I've found. You contact, from what I hear, you contact the school, you contact the headmaster or mistress, and they don't want to, or they say they're forbidden by law.
They're not.
Yeah, but that's what they say. And so what that results in is the famous Catholic Church passing the trash, it's called in the trade, where priests just were moved, as we all know, from one parish to another, and it's happened to a certain extent with teachers, and in fact, not to get back to Horace Mann, but several teachers went on to other schools. There are so many more suggestions that we could make. We need written school policies, and I have to say that they have to be far more extensive than we've gotten into. They should deal with cyber issues, they should deal with bullying, harassment, and not just sex crimes. They should deal with what are appropriate boundaries for teachers with students. Should they ever be allowed in a room alone with a kid who's under a certain age? I mean, sometimes things like that will happen, but we should have the policies that mandate that they are not appropriate. And stalking, that should be part of an online guide in every school and college, and a handbook that's handed out to students and parents and everybody who works with children. I'd like to see an outside monitor of all of these issues. Every school should have an internal way of reporting a sexual abuse incident, as well as an external one. There's got to be someone outside the school, because often a student or a teacher or a bystander person is not going to trust the internal system. Because what has happened, not just at Horace Mann, but virtually numerous private or independent schools, and I'm sure public schools have had this issue. The complaint is quashed. The victim is told that he or she needs the equivalent of a video or audio tape before they can go forward. Oh, it's your word. He's a great teacher. She's a great teacher. We can't possibly proceed. Now, you don't have enough. The schools have been concerned only with their reputation, their image, the worry about losing funding, and that has been their focus. It has never been to date on the rights of the victim. It has never been on the need for the victim to have counseling. It has never been on the need to tell parents about what's been going on or to warn people in the school of what's been going on. There's no time to keep going on, but there are so many things that we can put online and we can put into guidebooks. And I know Rob Boynton is a great proponent for grading schools in New York. We're going to send our policies to every school. CASA will hopefully do this on the federal university stage, and he wants to have some kind of system. I don't personally know that I want grading, but I think there should be a way, like U.S. News and World Report, which Martin mentioned. They have categories for everything. If there were a category for schools in terms of sexual abuse reports and findings, I think that could make a huge difference, and we should attempt to have that done. Now, under CASA, there will have to be, on the federal level, reporting, as I said, but we need that on the school level. But there's so many more things. A lot of it starts with training and independent ability for someone outside the school to deal with things so that the school cannot continue to protect itself. A lot of schools, or I should say a few schools, have instituted these guidelines. I think Yeshiva has been one of them. And you can look at their website and learn a lot. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, because they, in addition to some good schools like Deerfield, have gone and hired top law firms who have investigated at great expense and at great length what has happened. Horace Mann took the opposite approach. It still does. Let's stonewall. Let's not cooperate. It'll all go away. And that is not acceptable. So we've only touched upon the problem tonight and the dimension of the problem and the failure to deal with it appropriately, both at the university and the school level. All of the basic guidelines we've all referred to have got to be put in place going forward. But again, I would repeat, mandatory reporting, laws that cover every private school, a statewide independent inspector general like Dick Condon, for all schools, public and private. These are only a few of the things that we have to advocate for, and that we need to put pressure on our politicians to do, because there's nothing more important than our children, and we have to protect them from these terrible crimes and acts. We can do it if we expose the problem, if we focus on it, if we demand change, and if we work together. There are a number of people I'd like to thank tonight. I have my little list here. Rob Boynton and I worked on this together for the last few months, and wouldn't have been possible without him and the Horace Mann Action Committee, who backs all of these things. Amos Camel and Mark Fisher for exposing the problem to begin with in terms of Horace Mann, which led to a lot of exposure of other issues. Peter Brooks for being the human computer on the investigation and always being there to help us. I want to thank the Bronx District Attorney's Office, which actually investigated and spoke to numerous people with the police in terms of trying to pursue a criminal actions in the Horace Mann case, but they were barred by the statute of limitations. But they were extremely cooperative and have been, and I know will continue to be with us, and Jill Starashevsky, the assistant district attorney we dealt with. Obviously, I want to thank Congresswoman Maloney for giving her time to come here and talk to us about issues that are as important as we all think they are. And I want to thank our panelists who, frankly, I think contributed a great deal to the dialogue of what has to be something we'll continue to focus on in the future. Thank you for coming.